Okay, so let us pick up where we left off. See if I can get my, there we go, my little pen working. Okay, so we are going to start talking about our last group of seed plants known as the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. Well, one thing that's nice here is there's only one phylum we have to worry about, the phylum Anthophyta. So the word angiosperm, that word angio means enclosed. And it's a reference to the fact that the seeds are going to be enclosed within the fruits. And that the ovules are going to be enclosed in structures called ovaries. And this is in contrast to the gymnosperms, where that word gymno meant naked because the seeds were found directly on the cone scales, not enclosed within a fruit. Here we're going to have the seeds, and before they become seeds, the ovules enclosed within either an ovary wall or, after it ripens, a fruit. So there are an enormous amount of angiosperms, hugely diverse group, 250,000 species, making up over 85% of all land plants. And the two structures that are sort of integral to the angiosperms, of course, are flowers, which are structures specialized for sexual reproduction, and fruits, which are actually the mature ovary and sometimes other portions of the plant that surround the seeds. So here's our little phylogeny. There's our angiosperm group there. And let's take a look at their structures. So I think we're all familiar with a flower as something pretty that smells good, and we like them. But for the plant, these are structures that are specialized for reproduction and for attraction of animals that hopefully can help them get pollinated. So let's look at these different structures we see in a flower. So most of the parts of the flower are actually highly modified leaves. And the most leaf-like looking of these structures are something called the sepals. Okay, I have to move my board here, so hopefully I won't make you guys seasick here. Sorry about that. The sepals. These are right here, the sepals. These are usually green, leaf-like appendages. And their job is to typically protect the flower while it's still in bud. So you might notice before the flower opens, it's covered with that green layer. Those are the sepals. They typically are protective. Then, of course, the most familiar structure are the petals, right? That's what I think we think of. These are typically brightly colored appendages to attract pollinators. Now, the male reproductive parts of the flower are known as the stamens. The stamens are going to produce microspores that will develop into pollen. And this pollen, of course, holds the male gametophyte. The microscopic male gametophyte that produces sperm. So there are two parts of our of our stamen. This stalk-like part right here, that is called the filament, and it is what is going to hold up the pollen-producing sac. And then at the top, we have an anther. which is the terminal sac that produces pollen. And in this picture anyway, it looks like this anther has two main chambers. And each of these chambers would be considered a microsporangia, right? Where our microspores are housed. Okay, more flower parts. Whoops, I'm ahead of myself. That's the male parts. Let's talk about the female parts. So we have our carpel, and I apologize, my words are, so here's our carpel. So the carpel, this entire structure here. So this is actually a modified leaf that contains one or more ovules. Right, we talked about ovules when we talked about gymnosperms and how with the ovule we've got the integument and we've got the megagametophyte, or rather we got the megasporangium, excuse me, that contains the megaspore, which will become the megagametophyte, producing eggs. So ultimately, within these ovules, we find the eggs. So let's look at the parts of this carpel, because there are multiple parts to be considered here. So we have the very top part that we call the stigma. The stigma is the very tip, which is usually somehow sticky. That is going to receive the pollen. What we call the style is a long tube leading from stigma to ovary. So this is the style, and the style basically is a track that, so a pollen grain, let me erase some of this here so you can see what we're looking at. A pollen grain will land here, and this style essentially is a track that this pollen tube is going to go down, and it's going to deliver its sperm to one of those 6 ovules within the final part of the carpel we need to know about, which is called the ovary, and that is this whole structure right here. So the ovary is the structure at the base of the carpel that produces ovules. And it will be typically this ovary wall that eventually will ripen and get larger and fleshy perhaps and sweet and become a fruit. And these ovules are going to mature into seeds. So let's just look for a second at the evolution of these different structures. As I said, most of these are modified leaves. And you can kind of, this is a hypothesis of how this came to be. So we have this idea that we had this leaf where the ovules were just born along the margin of these leaves. And some leaves perhaps folded in a little bit more than other leaves. And this protected the carpel a little bit better, or protected the ovules a little bit better, so they had a higher chance of survival. And over evolutionary time, through selection of these more protected ovules, we started to get a complete folding and fusing into this carpel. Now, one thing, a term to sort of be aware of, because it's kind of important actually, is that we can sometimes get multiple carpels fused together in a complex structure called a pistil. And sometimes the word carpel and pistil get used interchangeably. So the carpel, a carpel is sort of like one unit here. But when we have more than one carpels, more than one carpel fused together, we would call the whole structure a pistil, and we would say it's in fact a compound pistil because it's made of multiple carpels. All right, let's look at this angiosperm life cycle for a minute. It's in many ways very similar to the gymnosperm life cycle, so if that wasn't too much of a pain for you, this shouldn't be too bad. There are a few exceptions. So let's start by looking at our pollen here. Okay, so let's look at our male structures, which are the stamens, at the tip of which is an anther. So here's our anther, and in this case we have 4 chambers here. Each of these chambers would be considered a microsporangia, and within those microsporangia we have these microsporocytes. These microsporocytes are specialized cells that will divide by meiosis to become microspores. Okay, so those are our microspores. These microspores will mature into the pollen grains. Now, in the angiosperms, we have several cells in our pollen grains that have specific functions. We have what's called the generative cell. This generative cell will eventually divide into 2 sperm cells. And we have the tube cell, just like we did in gymnosperms, that will produce the pollen tube. Let's take a minute and look at the female structures. So here is our carpel, and for the moment here, let's just zoom in and think about the what's going on with this ovary structure. So we have our ovary, and within that ovary is our ovule. So the ovule includes the integument, and it also includes the megasporangium. Within that megasporangium is the megasporocyte. That megasporocyte, by the word cyte means cell, so it's just a cell that will undergo meiosis to produce the megaspores. So we eventually end up with our megaspores. Now, we have 4 megaspores to start with here, but 3 will degenerate and only 1 is going to be functional. So we have our megaspores that will develop into the megagametophyte that can produce the egg. All right, so here is our 1 egg cell, and I know you can see that there's a bunch of other cells here, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But I just wanted to get us to actually making this egg cell. Okay, so we have our male gametophyte, the pollen, and we have our female egg within the ovule. Now it's a matter of getting them together. In a flowering plant, this usually needs the help of some kind of pollinator, like a bee or like a bird. So an insect will, or wind, actually, there's lots of wind-pollinated angiosperms. So somehow a pollen grain needs to make its way to that stigma, that sticky receptive surface. And typically the stigma, in addition to being sticky, it also contains the right types of chemicals that will signal to the pollen grain that this is the place where it wants to allow a pollen tube to germinate. And so this pollen tube will germinate and go down the style all the way to the egg cell, and it's going to discharge not 1 but 2 of those sperms. So remember I said that 1 cell in the pollen grain will make the pollen tube, and then we have 2 sperm cells. That generative cell divides twice to be 2 sperm cells. 1 is going to fertilize the egg. The other is going to fertilize these 2 nuclei in the middle that we call the polar nuclei. So the fertilized egg will become the zygote. The fertilized polar nuclei is going to become what we call the endosperm. And you can see 3N, this is triploid, because there were 2 nuclei, and then we're going to fuse a 3rd sperm nucleus to it. So it actually is triploid, 3 sets of chromosomes. This endosperm is going to be the food source for the developing zygote. This is something called double fertilization, and it is unique to angiosperms. It's actually really quite, this is a key thing. It's actually quite important, this double fertilization idea. So a few more terms I want to throw out there that I didn't throw out there yet is I wanted to talk about the micropyle. Because this is where the pollen tube is going to terminate and release those sperms. So the micropyle is this little teeny opening here just before we would actually enter inside the ovule, that little tiny opening that allows the sperm to get in. That is the micropyle. Spelled like that, micropyle. Okay, so the zygote, in this case, is going to develop into the sporophyte embryo, and it's got 2 what we call cotyledons. Those are embryonic seed leaves, and we'll talk about those things more when we talk about the differences between monocots and eudicots. And this triploid endosperm is what's going to nourish the sporophyte embryo. As I said, seeds are such a great adaptation because they allow this baby plant to have its own mobile food source that always goes with it. And that is what the endosperm is all about. Now, in the gymnosperms, we didn't have double fertilization. Rather, it was that fleshy tissue left over. And let me go back here real quick. Sorry. Give me a second here. Here we go. So we have this food supply, which is basically just the extra fleshy gametophyte tissue of the female gametophyte in a gymnosperm is quite fleshy and stays that way, and that is what acts as the food source as opposed to the triploid endosperm that we have in the angiosperm. So that's kind of a key difference between the two. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about fruits. So when fertilization occurs, it's going to trigger hormonal changes that will stimulate the ovary tissues to transform into fruit tissues. So what is a fruit? Let's start there. Fruit is a mature ovary that develops from a carpel. Basically, it is a mature ovary, and sometimes it can include other floral parts. They can be either fleshy, think of a grape, think of a tomato, or they can be dry, think of a nut, or think of the fruits off a maple tree. So here are some examples of fleshy fruits: tomatoes, grapefruits, nectarines, anything that's pulpy and fleshy. And then we have some dry fruits, like the wings or the samaras off a maple, or burdocks, or even many nuts are what you would think of as dry fruits. And the whole point of fruits is to aid in seed dispersal. And if you look at the different adaptations on these fruits, you can see in many cases how they're dispersing, right? They might have little barbs like this that can hitch a ride on an animal's fur. They might have wings that will help them get some distance from the parent's plant when they fall. Here we've got little parachute type threads that will catch the wind and allow these milkweed seeds to disperse far from the parent plant. Or what about fruit? That's a pretty big investment for the plant to make. And it makes that investment so that an animal will eat it. And animals will move very far away and disperse these seeds in their droppings elsewhere. So the whole goal of seeds is to get as far as they can and disperse this population. And so we see lots of modifications to allow that to happen. So as I mentioned, we start out with an ovary with an ovule inside. And once fertilization happens, it triggers hormonal changes that will stimulate the ovary to transform into a fruit and the ovule to transform into a mature seed. So here we're looking at the development of an apple. And this is kind of an interesting one because an apple actually, most of what becomes the fleshy part of the fruit in the apple is not the ovary wall itself, but actually a part of the flower called the receptacle, which is kind of this part down here. It's what we would call an accessory fruit, where we have a different part of the plant contributing to a lot of the fruit. So let's say, for example, however, we're not talking about an accessory fruit, we're talking about something a little more standard, sort of a normal fruit. It is typically the ovary wall that becomes the fruit, and this ovary wall will develop into what we call the pericarp. So let's think of an orange, for example. So let's go back up here and think about an orange. At one point, well, I guess this is a grapefruit, but close enough. At one point, this was an ovary. Actually, it was a compound pistil, and each of these sections was a chamber. And as it developed, what was the ovary wall became what we call the pericarp, which includes the outer rind and all of this fleshy tissue here. Okay, so let's look at a couple fruit types, and we're going to have a lab on fruit types, so I'm not going to go over it real deeply here. So most fruits develop from a single carpel or several fused carpels, and we would call that a simple fruit. So peas would be an example of a simple fruit, right? We have a single carpel here. The carpel had multiple ovules, but a single carpel that developed into a fruit. So this would be the pericarp here, this outer area. And then we've got the seeds inside. And this would be an example of a relatively dry fruit as well. We also have what are called aggregate fruits. Aggregate fruits happen when you have a single flower that has more than one separate carpel. So it's got multiple carpels, but all of these carpels were completely separate. So what am I trying to draw here when I have a board? So in this case, get a good pen. We had multiple separate carpels on a single flower, and each of these multiple separate carpels became its own little fruitlet, but they stay clustered together. And a great example of this is something like a raspberry or a blackberry, right? If you look at them, you could actually pull all those little tiny balls apart, because it's actually an aggregation of lots of little tiny fruitlets. There's also what we call multiple fruits. A multiple fruit forms when we have a tight cluster of flowers that all fuse together during ripening and become kind of one fleshy unit. So a great example is a pineapple. You may have noticed when you cut a pineapple, a lot of times you get like these really annoying leafy type structures. Those really annoying leafy type structures are sepals and leaves, because you're actually dealing with an entire inflorescence. You're dealing with a big cluster of flowers that all fuse together, and that's why you get those, each of these diamonds represents one flower, and that's why you get lots of green tissue in between that's a little annoying to deal with, but it's pretty cool when you think about it. And then finally we have the accessory fruit, like apples. I talked about this a little bit before. An accessory fruit is when you have other tissues besides just the ovary wall becoming fleshy. So when you look at the apple flower, the ovules and the ovary are kind of sunk down far into the flower and are kind of right almost into the area we call the receptacle, the base of the flower. And it actually is this receptacle that gets fleshy and sugary and sweet and becomes most of the tissue of the apple. The ovary wall itself actually is not very, it's that leathery part that is not very interesting to eat. Okay, I'm going to end this video here, and then we're going to pick up and we're going to talk about the different clades of the angiosperm, so see you in a minute.